the indicators don't lie. If you hold XRP, don't mess this up. This is your last chance. I wanted to ask, what's going on with XRP? Look at how good it's getting. But a lot of, traders are making this mistake with XRP right now.
You guys need to listen very closely right now because the Fed is about to unleash an XRP bombshell. And
It's what I've been telling you. Fed is coming in and it's getting more bullish on the markets. While we were still waiting for the big patterns, here's Fed coming in. In 1 month, the Fed will cut rates and blame a weaker labor market. So they were worried about the last report, not having too many jobs. Again, Fed cutting rates is a good price indicator. We now have PPI inflation growth at a 3-year high and CPI inflation for above 2% for 53 straight months. You will be left behind here. In the near term, risk to inflation are tilted to the upside and risk to employment to the downside. So that's what their report is. Baseline outlook and the shifting balance of risk may warrant adjusting our policy stance. So this is kind of a hint that they might, just as well cut rates, which is going to push altcoins higher and Bitcoin dominance lower.
Rates. Now, what I haven't done is a deep dive analysis on what this means. And I wanted to first feature something from the Kaposi letter here going over this because, frankly speaking, it is shocking. They say that Fed Chair Powell has caved. In 1 month, the Fed will cut rates and blame a weaker labor market. Meanwhile, we now have PPI inflation growth at a 3-year high and CPI inflation above 2% for 53 straight months.
That isn't that
assets,
bad.
You will be left behind. Here's why. Now, we're going to tear through this thread here. We're going to cover exactly what it means, what I think it's going to mean for XRP in just a second. But first, I do have a real stand.
So look at this. Fed's mandate, the Fed's purpose is to reduce unemployment and avoid deflation. And they said that, they might have to cut it to lower basically their own job rates. Look at the, 2022. 15% of people unemployed. It's rising to 4.2% right now, which isn't really scary at all. But it is the lowest it's ever been in history almost. Since 2021, the Fed has been laser focused on the inflation side of this mandate. And that's what they've been focusing on. But Fed Chair Powell says the shifting balance of risk may warrant adjusting our policy stance, which means cutting rates. And that's why Trump wants them to cut rates, because cutting the rates is going to be good for real estate and it's going to be good for crypto, which he has a major stake in. So that's why Trump is saying, for 1% interest rates.
A Fed Chair Powell just made a massive pivot. Powell said the shifting balance of risks may warrant adjusting our policy stance. In other words, the Fed now views unemployment as a bigger risk than inflation. This is what's known as stagflation. That is what we are in right now. But this shift isn't happening because inflation is at the Fed's 2% target. In fact, core CPI is back above 3%, and PPI inflation just saw a 0.9% month-over-month jump, its biggest since 2022. So why have the risks shifted? Well, in the latest data, over 258,000 jobs were revised out of the May and June data alone.
I feel like that was the firing we had, right? There was a lot of news politics talk. It's because Trump fired a lot of state government employees. So they basically said they might have to cut rates because of that to boost the market, because this definitely hit a dent. This is a lot of people, and if a lot of people don't have jobs, it creates a problem in the economy.
That's more than the entire population of Scottsdale, Arizona. And year to date, 461,000 jobs have been revised down. As we have been saying, many leading indicators of the labor market are absolutely cracking. And so the Fed cannot ignore this. If they continue to ignore this, America will be in a very tough spot with rising inflation and rising unemployment, both of which will come.
The last time they ignored, the unemployment rates is literally when we had 1936, it was, I feel like, where it was one of the worst economies. And we also saw that in 2008. That's why they want to prevent this before it even happens. If the economy is so nice now, the Fed is basically trying to help you, right? It's trying to not just pump the markets or keep the markets down. What it's actually trying to do is make the markets really sustainable for 10 to 20 years. So the 2020, 2008 recession never happens.
Completely destroy the economy, the stock market, everything. Right? I mean, if people can't buy stocks, stock prices won't go up. If people can't buy, afford to live, they won't be buying products and services, and the entire economy eventually starts to crater. And that's precisely what Jerome Powell is hoping to avoid.
So yeah, cutting rates is basically going to fix the Fed's small problem, but they're saying the economy is pretty good right now, which is another indicator for XRP prices that they could be going up.
And so Jerome Powell is left with the impossible decision. Do I lower rates and inflate the currency even more than it's already being inflated to help unemployment levels? And the answer to that seems to be yes. Now, what we haven't talked about is what does this mean for XRP? Well, let's first look at what the S&P 500 has been doing. When the Fed cuts rates within 2% of all-time highs, the S&P 500 loves it. And 20 of the last 20 times this has happened.
So yeah, historically in September or whenever we get the rate cuts, I feel like also this is priced in. But the S&P has risen an average of 14%, and of course the XRP will follow. Asset owners will party like it's 2021. So each time we saw rate cuts, the markets have risen. This is good. The issue here is, like, how many rate cuts will we get? We've been waiting for these rate cuts a long time. I feel like one is already priced in. What I mean by priced in is I mean people expect, that they are going to be there. So they're not going to be buying XRP because of that. But if we get 2 or 3 rate cuts, I think 3 is going to be a very small chance. That is where the markets could really move, even if we get 2 rate cuts.
What do? I buy stocks, I buy crypto, I buy real estate.
So look at 2024 rate cuts. We got about, 4%, and then in the next 3 months, we got 3%, which aligns with September, October, November dates I've been giving to you guys.
People are going to be buying cryptocurrency. That's what I very strongly believe. And I think even more people are going to come into the XRP army, way more than ever seen historically before because of this phenomena that's been going on since the beginning of the Federal Reserve. So it's interesting to look at what the top dogs are doing in the space with this information in mind. I think it's no coincidence that Michael Saylor today made a statement that Bitcoin is on sale. Of course he would say this right now. Of course he would. He realizes that all digital assets are on sale if the Fed's going to continue to cut rates. Because investors are going to continue to look.
They're going to keep buying. That's when the XRP is going to be cheaper as long as these rates get cut. But there's a lot of smaller partnerships we're not talking about. The reason why I'm not talking about them is because I try to focus on the major partnerships for XRP. This is the big thing. Dubai travelers can book flights with XRP. We were seeing always this with Shiba Inu, but the big things that are changing is these rate cuts, and that's why billionaires are calling for this market boom that is going to be happening in October. I don't think, even though, guys, listen very carefully, even though the rate cuts are going to be in September, I feel like it's not going to change the prices that much for XRP. I feel like especially looking historically what happened every 4 years after the Bitcoin halving, September was always pretty bad. Now, however, we do and we can push for another price point in October is when ton of good news is going to be happening along with these rate cuts is what's really going to change everything.